It's time for our next installment in our Hall of Faith series. And I really enjoyed the last two videos and looking at these last two characters. And the character today is another short mention. It's not quite as short as Isaac was in our last episode, but this too is just one verse. Maybe it's a couple sentences. It's a little bit longer of a verse, but it's still just one verse long. And I said a couple videos ago, like there was this natural break. Let me see if I can see Hebrews 11. We did all the setup. And then there was Hebrews 11, 1 through, 1 through 12. I mean, we talked about creation. We talked about Abel. We talked about Enoch. We talked about Noah. We talked about Abraham. We talked about Sarah. 12 verses in all of those cases, 5 or 6 examples. And then there was this break, this paragraph where Hebrews 11 says all these people died without having received the promise. They welcomed them from a distance. And I said, there's kind of this natural break in the flow of things. And I said, I want to be aware as a student, as somebody studying this chapter, I want to be aware that the author may be shifting gears, turning their attention, doing something from a literary perspective. There might be a major or a slight shift. There might be no shift at all. This might be the exact same conversation because we were picking up a theme in Hebrews 1 through 12. Like basically all 5, 6 of these examples were stories of people who were looking beyond their immediate circumstances. Faith was being certain of what you hope for, confident of what you hope for, certain of what you do not see. They were believing that God was up to something bigger, God was up to something outside of, and that was pretty true. I mean, like story. That seemed to be the theme. And now we're turning 2 to 3 stories in, and we haven't talked about our story today. Our character today is going to be Jacob. But there might be a slight shift taking place here. This second section seems to be less about, like if there was and I'm still processing this. The first section seemed to be about people's belief in the bigger picture. And these stories seem to be about us putting that belief into action, right? The practical experience. Like it seemed like the first 12 verses were about this, and these verses have been more about this, if that makes sense. And so we talked about Abraham and the sacrifice, right? Believing he would get Isaac back from the dead, resurrection, hope. That's about action. We talked about Isaac in the last video. Isaac he had these prayerful plans, and then those plans didn't come to pass like he thought they would, and he trusted that God was up. So it's still this idea of trusting that God is up to something, but instead of this, it's been more trusting that God is at work even in the specifics. Even looking inward to it. So the other ones kind of looked at beyond our circumstances. These stories seem to be looking maybe more at the circumstances themselves. And I think we're going to see that here. So this verse, the next mention is going to be Jacob. So when you think about the whole life of Jacob, I mean, that's a catalog, right? What is the author of Hebrews 11 going to say about Jacob's life? Where was the part where we saw faithfulness? Because Jacob's life's kind of a mess. Like he has his moments, but it's kind of like, where does his faithfulness shine? What's going to get mentioned? It seems to be, if you remember, the Isaac reference was kind of weird. It was like, why are we talking about Isaac blessing his sons as an act of faith? And we talked about why that was an act of faith. And it's going to feel very similar. Hebrews 11:21. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. I'll read that again. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned, on the top of his staff. Now, we talked about Isaac's blessing. Isaac, because it seems like here's 2 mentions of blessings. Like, why are these blessings an act of faith? And we talked about how Isaac's blessing was an act of faith because the blessings didn't roll out as he planned. He had prayerfully prepared a blessing for Esau and a blessing for Jacob, and they got switched, and he trusted the process. He trusted that God must have been in that. Now we have Jacob blessing his sons. And not particularly, we might be able to say it's the same thing if it were Manasseh and Ephraim, but it doesn't reference them directly. It seems to reference the act of him blessing all of the sons. And then there's that phrase, as he leaned on the top of his staff. This is a reference to that Genesis 48. It's these last closing chapters, Genesis 48, 49. And what Jacob is doing in these chapters is he's doing something that in a lot of ways is very un-Jacob-like. We've seen Jacob do all kinds of different things. He was selfish for a large part of his life. Rachel dies. His family falls apart. He seems to almost get timid in a way, for me. And then at the end of his story, it would be so easy for Jacob. Like, they had it made. Like, think about the end of the book of Genesis. They're in Egypt. Joseph is the second in command. The whole family comes down. The family's reconciled and restored. They're living in the land of Goshen. Like, if I'm Jacob, I'm like, this worked out. This worked out. But Jacob had been, like, intimately involved with God's promise. It's like one of the craziest parts of Jacob's story is that even though he's kind of deceptive and selfish and kind of slimy and does all these weird things by devious means sometimes, and he has his high moments, but there's a lot of like kind of weird, awkward, low moments in his story. And yet God keeps showing up and he keeps saying, this is my promise. This is my promise. This is my promise to you. This is my promise to you. God kept insisting all throughout Jacob's life that he had a plan. There was a promise, and Jacob was a part of that promise. And now Jacob is at the end of his life with all of the craziness and all of the dysfunction, and it seems like the story has worked. It would have been so easy, guys. Brothers and sisters, it would have been so easy for Jacob just to have been like, yeah, okay, we'll just let it ride. And Jacob doesn't do that. Jacob blesses his sons and goes to Joseph as he leans on his staff and he says, Joseph, you have to take my bones out of here. You got to take my bones and you got to bury them in Canaan. And you're like, okay, okay, sure. You have burial wishes. You have death wishes. You have wishes that will do. Okay, that's fine. And Jacob says, no, Joseph, you got to promise me. And he's like, okay, I'll promise you. No, Joseph, you got to swear to me. Like, Jacob is really adamant about this. What is going on in this story? Jacob is so adamant about this. And a lot of people, I heard a rabbi once call this Jacob's heroic moment. Like, he makes it all the way to the end of his story. And instead of letting his story just kind of like fade out into the sunset, Jacob goes back, grits his teeth, digs in his heels, and his heroic act is reminding his son, Joseph, of what the story of God is. You cannot settle here in Egypt. I know it's working out for you today. I know that everything seems, I don't know if comfort is the word I want to use, but I know that everything's panned out. I know that Joseph is second. I know that you've got influence and you've got power and you've got some level of sustenance and provision. I know, but this is not the story that God called our family to. Do not settle in Egypt. This is why Jacob looks at Joseph and he says, take my bones home, because this isn't it. And man, as I think about it, it actually just makes me, what an act of like I get it. I get the heroic act of Jacob's faith. Like, after a life of just, what a mess. And his last, like his dying act is to remind his family of what the story is. Like, I will not be buried here. This is not where God called us. And so the writer of Hebrews calls us out and says we can't be people that shrink back. On one hand, I think the writer of Hebrews is talking about people that are suffering, people that are struggling, people that are being persecuted. And he's saying we can't shrink. There's lots of conversation that has been pointed in this direction. I also wonder if there's not a few mentions here that might be pointed at a whole group of people that in the midst of all of this persecution, they have the opportunity to take an easy way out. They have the opportunity to not be persecuted. If they just kind of give up on the story of God, maybe just a little, maybe just shave a little off the edge, they won't have to suffer. They won't have to persevere in the same way. It'll be okay. And the writer of Hebrews says, do not shrink back. Do not compromise the mission of God that he gave us. We have to be people that remain faithful and honor the legacy. I mean, it's Jacob that the people of God are named after. Jacob had another name. His name was Israel. Like Jacob wasn't just Jacob. Jacob was also Israel. Jacob was the father of the people of God that stood in covenant relationship with God. A God who said, I'm going to use you to put the world back together. And Jacob said to Joseph, and in some level, Jacob says to you and me in the midst of this hall of faith, his voice still rings out. As clear as Abel's blood crying out from the ground, Jacob's voice echoes throughout history and says, take my bones with you because this isn't home. May we be reminded of where home really is. It makes me think of that paragraph that we had in the middle, that break, where the author said they were looking for a different home. They were looking for a heavenly city. If they wanted to go back, they could have. Like Jacob is the perfect example, the perfect embodiment of that point. If they wanted to go back home, they could have gone back home. But they were looking for a better city. They were looking for a better story. They were looking for a better mission. That's what Jacob did as he leaned on his staff and he blessed his sons as he was dying. He didn't let the story die with him. That's good. So those are my thoughts. That's my lesson. That's my reflection for the life of Jacob and the mention of Jacob in the Great Hall of Faith. May he be an inspiration to you and to me this week.